Thousands have died in the so-called war on drugs in the Philippines. The International Criminal Court wants to open a full investigation into possible crimes against humanity, but the president won't cooperate. So what can the ICC achieve? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. The Philippine president's so-called war on drugs is one of his most controversial policies. Rodrigo Duterte's supporters say his tough stance delivers results. But international observers, including the UN, call it a brutal crackdown. The government says security forces killed around 7,000 people in anti-drug raids since Duterte took office in 2016. But rights groups believe the figure is closer to 30,000. A preliminary report by the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor found crimes against humanity may have been committed. And on Monday, the second last day of her term in office, Fatou Bensouda asked judges to authorize a full investigation which could hold Duterte and his allies accountable. Jamila Alandogan has more from Manila.
ICC Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda has officially requested the pretrial chamber for her to be given authority to start an investigation. Actually means that a full-blown investigation might happen anytime soon. That also means that over the last few years, the ICC has been looking at a large amount of public information in addition to the reports, complaints, and petitions submitted by the families of the victims of the drug war, human rights lawyers, human rights organizations, and even members of the opposition. In fact, just yesterday, a fourth supplemental report from families of the victims have been submitted again to the ICC, and this includes testimonies and evidence against Duterte's so-called war on drugs. And of course, this release also includes, and what is quite striking about it, is that the release by the ICC also mentions that similar acts were committed in Davao City within the period of 1988 to 2016. These are the years when Duterte also ruled as mayor of Davao City in the southern Philippines for decades.
Well, Duterte's spokesman says the president won't cooperate. Harry Roque is the only Philippine lawyer on the ICC's list of counsel who can represent defendants or victims at the Hague-based tribunal. And he says the proposed investigation is politically motivated, adding the court has no jurisdiction.
I will ask the Philippine National Police, when you discharge your obligations under the so-called drug war, did you target civilians? Did you kill civilians willingly because they were civilians? Obviously, the answer is no. Were there deaths as an incident to a lawful operation in connection with the war against drugs, you did not target civilians as such. It was coincidental or collateral damage, either because the policeman had the right to defend himself using reasonable force, or they were in fact the subject of an attack and therefore justified by the principle of necessity and proportionality.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Manila, we have Lian Buan, who's a justice reporter for Rappler. In Dubai, Richard Heydarian, a political scientist and author of The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy. Joining us from Bangkok is Phil Robertson, who's the Deputy Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. Thanks for joining us on Inside Story. Welcome to the program. Lian, so the International Criminal Court wants to open a full investigation into what it calls possible crimes against humanity. Is this a welcome move amongst the public in the Philippines? What's the reaction to that?
Well, it's definitely a welcome move and a sigh of relief for all the groups that have worked for the last 4 years or last 3 years to get this action by the ICC. Now, if it's a welcome move by the entire population of the Philippines, that's maybe another question that maybe Richard could answer later, because President Duterte, we know, still enjoys high popularity. So his supporters may be on his side on this one. But for the victims and the lawyers and the human rights community, this is definitely a welcome move.
Okay, and speaking of human rights, Phil Robertson, Human Rights Watch has been pushing for an investigation for some time now. So you, of course, must welcome this decision. Talk us through the significance of it.
Well, it's a huge step forward for potential justice for the victims of the people who are killed in the war on drugs. You're finally talking about the possibility of accountability, because quite clearly the Philippines' national mechanisms for accountability and justice simply don't function. The reality here is that we're seeing, as a result of this, I think a probably increased focus on the potential that we will have some people who are, senior policemen, senior politicians, ultimately facing international justice. And that, I think, brings real hope to the victims of these crimes and to the families who, have had their cases swept under the rug. I mean, there's been no effective investigation of the vast majority of these cases. Many of these were cover-ups. We had handguns planted. We had, people who are, filing fictitious police reports and things like that. It has been an ongoing effort to try to fight through a system that was designed not to provide justice for these cases to be heard. And for the ICC to take this step, I think is very, very important.
Okay, Richard, the presidential spokesman, though, said that the president himself will never cooperate with an ICC investigation. And he said that this investigation is, in fact, doomed to fail. So without the cooperation of the Philippines government, what challenges does this probe face?
Well, I think the statement from the outgoing prosecutor of the ICC was very important because it sets the tone for the new prosecutor, Mr. Karim Khan, who's taking over the ICC. It's also very legally important because it rejects the government's claim that the ICC has no longer any jurisdiction over potential mass atrocities in the Philippines because the Philippines withdrew from the ICC in 2019. The ICC made it very clear that it does have jurisdiction when the Philippines was a member and over crimes that actually extend well beyond the Philippines' accession and membership to the ICC. It's also a very clear rejection of the Philippines' claim that now that it has created an interagency panel, it can itself deal with these issues of accountability because of the principle of complementarity. The international body can only step in if local bodies are not able to execute their proper duties. So the ICC is clearly saying that they cannot trust the Philippine government to do that, and they have clearly jurisdiction over this issue and potentially even over extrajudicial killing allegations when President Duterte was not a president but was a mayor of Davao City. So that this has huge implications. Now, the key issue also here is timing. On one hand, this may have come a little bit late for a lot of people. We're expecting this to come back in 2019 or perhaps in 2020. The statement of the outgoing prosecutor made it clear that the pandemic and other complications were at play here, but she said, we are at the crossroads, we have to do something about it. But in a way, it's also a little bit too early in the sense that the Philippines is heading towards the next presidential elections. So the president may be able to reject an investigation for the next year. But what if this also convinces President Duterte to try to stay in power by other means? For instance, trying to run as a vice president in the next elections, or try to have his daughter run as the next president, or his aide, Mr. Senator Bongo. So in this sense, the timing is also crucial in political terms, because President Duterte may be able to push back against investigation for now, but by next year, we're going to have a next president, and the next president may have a very different predilection, and that gives an incentive for President Duterte to also shape the outcome of the next election. So this has also huge political implications.
Right. So, Richard, he is pushing back against the ICC investigation, and you were mentioning the Davao killings earlier on when he was mayor of that city, and the ICC is saying that it has jurisdiction to even investigate those killings. But again, this rejected by Duterte's spokesman. Is this all something that is of great concern to Duterte, including the Davao investigation?
Yes, I mean, this is not also only about President Duterte, right? So the statement made it very clear that the Philippine National Police may be involved in thousands, if not tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings or mass atrocities. So not only President Duterte, but a lot of his henchmen, some of them are senators now, a lot of them are in top positions of government. A lot of them will try to stay in power for years and decades to come, all of these people have an interest in making sure that this investigation will not happen, and they have been relying on President Duterte to shield them and to protect them for the foreseeable future. But things could radically change under the next presidency if that president doesn't share the current president's predisposition. By the way, it's also quite interesting that the Philippine government also signaled that it may rejoin and re-accede to the ICC so long as the ICC respects them. So there's also the possibility that the Philippine Senate or the next Filipino presidency rejoins the ICC and makes a recommitment to international human rights instruments. So all of these elements are playing into the calculation of the president on what he's going to do ahead of a shift in presidency and political landscape last year. But then again, this is not only about the president, but many people in the military, in the police forces, in the law enforcement, many people now in the Senate and top positions who have an interest in not facing any kind of prosecution or investigation in the coming years.
Right. And Lian, the Duterte spokesman also claimed that almost all of Bensouda's sources were, as he described them, enemies of the president. He did put out some names, including a former senator, as well as the Communist Party founder, Joma Sison. So do his claims of this probe being politically motivated have any basis whatsoever?
Spokesperson Harry Roque is kind of fixated on the leftist groups and Senator Antonio Trillanes, but he conveniently leaves out that there have been more than a dozen communications sent to the ICC, not just Senator Trillanes', not just Congressman Alejanos, and not just the National Union of People's Lawyers. There were more than others, and the report of Prosecutor Bensouda cites the Human Rights Watch and the Amnesty International, and there were a lot of redacted information from the report, which we can only presume are sources that are very confidential at this stage, so she cannot publicize it yet. So spokesperson Roque is fixated on two groups, which are only a fraction of the people that have worked tirelessly in the past couple of years to bring the communications to where it is now, which is seeking an authorization to open an investigation.
Phil, in 2017, Human Rights Watch found that Duterte and other senior officials have instigated and incited killings of mostly the urban poor in a campaign that could amount to crimes against humanity. And at the time, your organization had called on the Human Rights Council to launch its own investigation. Are you still making that call for the Human Rights Council investigation, and why?
Well, the Human Rights Council, in fact, did pass a resolution that Iceland sponsored that really did kick off a process at the Human Rights Council that ultimately resulted in a very authoritative report that was released last year and last June. And part of that report is actually cited by the prosecutor in their submission. I think that we are continuing to push forward on this, but what has happened is that there's been a failure of political will on some member states of the Human Rights Council, which has resulted in a negotiated discussion and a joint program between the UN and the Philippines, between the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And I think you're going to be hearing a lot about that, because this is the fig leaf that the Philippines government is going to be trying to use to say that, they're serious about actually moving forward with investigations of all these killings.
Are you referring to when Human Rights Watch said that the Human Rights Council has opted to provide technical cooperation and capacity building to the government? Is that what you're talking about here?
Well, the Human Rights Council was responding to a decision by member states to not push for the kind of second resolution that we wanted. And yes, so there is a technical program that is going on between the UN country team and the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights and the Philippines government. But that actual program really isn't producing anything. It's mostly about human rights promotion. And we just learned that the Philippines National Police only agreed to turn over 54 case files to the Department of Justice for investigation out of the literally thousands of cases that exist. I mean, there are 5,281 persons who were killed by the Philippines government's own account in operations that the police were involved in. And they're going to turn over 54 case files and say that this is progress. It's ludicrous. There's no political commitment within the Philippines government to actively investigate these cases. They have been looking for excuses to hide behind, and now their bluff has been called by the ICC prosecutor, and it's about time.
Speaking of time, Richard, just a moment ago also, you were referring to the timing of this ICC probe as being very interesting at the end of Bensouda's term. So how much of this is perhaps her wanting to make a mark on her legacy?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the tenor and the cadence of her statement, it was very much about, this. She wants this to be her legacy. She's essentially admitting that this was a tough issue. She was actually almost begging for support from international bodies. I mean, one problem that has been the case is that big countries like China have been openly defending the Philippines on these issues and accusing the international community and the ICC of intervention in the Philippine domestic affairs. So with the strategic patronship of these big powers, it has been quite difficult for the ICC to move forward, and also the gap between their jurisdiction and their mandate on one hand and their very limited resources on the other hand. Not to mention also in the past years, we see a country like the United States, the supposed flagship of democracy under the Trump administration. You had blatant attack on the ICC. They're not part of the ICC themselves. They threaten some of the judges at the ICC international bodies over investigations in Afghanistan and others. So the overall global climate has not been very friendly to the ICC, and that's why the outgoing prosecutor, she made it clear that she hopes that at least under her successor, and now with the Democratic administration back in the United States, things could dramatically change.
Well,
so
how do you think
really
the British lawyer, right, Karim Khan, is due to take over as the ICC's chief prosecutor on Wednesday? In fact, how's he going to handle this?
Well, we know that Mr. Karim Khan has been, he was the crown prosecutor back in Britain. He's been based in Iraq, investigating Daesh and ISIS human rights violations in Iraq and Syria, among others. He was very much involved in international cases involving mass atrocities in Serbia and Rwanda, among others. So this is a person with tremendous amount of experience as far as dealing with these very contentious issues is concerned. But then again, facing logistical difficulties and geopolitical constraint, Mr. Karim Khan has so many problems on his plate, and it's not clear whether the Philippine case will be a top priority for him, considering that there are all other problems all around the world, including the situation right now in Myanmar. So I think this is where we see that the outgoing prosecutor is almost appealing asking, begging her successor to take this on. And we clearly saw that the Philippine government also took on that. She said the Philippine government position is that this was an overnight 11-hour statement in an attempt to pressure the next prosecutor to deal with this issue. So I think this is also some uncertain element we have to look at.
Right. Lian, Phil Robertson was saying that the Philippines government and the justice system do not deal with this issue in the Philippines. Just domestically, tell us how the Philippines has dealt with this, because the government says, this is according to official statements, that the country's legal system is enough to bring abusers to justice. Is that what you've seen? Is that what you've covered at Rappler?
No, not at all, because early in 2019, we came out with a report. There have been already 5,000 killed in police operations at that time, and there were only 72 brought to the government prosecutor, 72 out of 5,000. That's a very small drop in the bucket. And the explanations we got from the police force was that there is a presumption of regularity in the shootouts and in the self-defense cases of these 5,000. And the prosecutors of the Department of Justice are mostly passive. They would not be proactive. They would not go to the crime scene and take these cases under their jurisdiction. So that's a very small drop in the bucket, which was admitted by the Justice Minister, Menardo Guevara, in his speech before the United Human Rights Council. He said the built-in systems have not been enough in the last couple of years, so they're doing this review to tighten all the investigative and prosecutorial gaps. But even that, they started that in June 2020, when they've known for the past couple of years that there were thousands of people killed in the drug war.
Right, but weren't they trying to signal in some way, Lian, that they're trying to get their act together?
Yes, they are trying to get their act together, but for what purpose? I mean, I think the Human Rights Watch has said that this is a ruse to get the International Criminal Court to back away from them. But I mean, there's always a value in domestic mechanisms working, but there should be a clear showing of that value, because it's been a year since the review was opened. There's been no complaints filed as a result of that review. There's been no criminal prosecutions started as a result of that review. And they're still, at this moment, just evaluating 50, I think it's 52, not 54, 52 cases out of the thousands of people killed in the drug war.
Phil, what's been the impact of the drugs war killings or the consequences for not only the victims, of course, but their families?
Well, what we've seen is the impacts have been devastating. We have seen families who are poor to start with become even more destitute. We've seen children have to drop out of school because the loss of a major breadwinner. They can't afford school fees. We've seen in some cases children made homeless because the family breaks apart. We have seen all sorts of traumatic stress that is not dealt with. We have seen marginalization of families because of stigma, claiming that your relative was a drug dealer, your father, your brother, whoever was a drug dealer and was killed. It has torn apart communities, and it has destroyed families, and it has put children on the street. It has been absolutely devastating, and the government of the Philippines really has no programs to even deal with the impacts on children, who are the most vulnerable and who the government of the Philippines says they want to help. There's no programs. They just are not doing anything except providing, small amounts of cash for funeral benefits for the person who has been killed. It's absurd. It is devastating for these families. There's no other word for it.
And Richard, what's the status of the drugs crackdown now? And also there are, perhaps you can confirm this for us, but there are unconfirmed reports that the killings have intensified during the COVID pandemic. Is that correct?
Well, as far as President Duterte is concerned, he has made it clear that he's sticking to his guns, right? I mean, perhaps even literally as far as war on drugs is concerned, that there has been no letting down in terms of his #1 priority when he came to office, which is fighting the problem of drugs and criminality in the country. By the way, the ICC also made it clear they're not against war on drugs. They're not going to pass any judgment on that. They just want to make sure that it's in accordance to rule of law. And what's interesting to look at in the Philippines is that vast majority of Filipinos support the war on drugs, but when they were asked, do you want the suspects to be kept alive or not, vast majority, even larger number, close to 90%, said they want them to be kept alive. So I think there's an agreement with President Duterte in terms of dealing with the problem, but in terms of methods, I think the public wants some refinements there. And I think the challenge also moving forward. But then how do you explain
his record approval ratings? This was something that Lian mentioned at the top of the program. The latest survey that I've seen, at least, which is from September 2020, puts his approval ratings at 91%, and this is according to Pulse Asia. How do you explain that?
Yes, and there are also other polls that suggest these numbers are closer to 60%. I mean, if you look at Philippine president, the previous president went down from office with around 55 to 60%. But, I have on the record the heads of one of the top agencies, survey agencies in the country, where I asked them, don't you think that the climate of fear affects also people's willingness to be honest in their surveys? I mean, let's not forget, surveys are not done in my community or in upper middle income or rich communities. Are mostly done actually in slum areas and poorer communities, which, by the way, are also tend to be the victims of extrajudicial killings. So what is your assurance that these numbers are not inflated or that people are fully honest about their willingness to say disapproving thing of the president? So I do believe the president has high approval rating of 40, 50, 60%, but I have some doubts about the 80 to 90%. But then again, I think a lot of people also support the president because they feel that at least he's doing something about it. And this is also a kind of a referendum on the perception of people on previous presidents about them not doing enough. So I think the challenge for the next president, whoever that's going to be, is to show that they're willing to do this war on drugs, but in a right way. And that's where the ICC comes in, because we should also focus on restorative justice, not only punitive justice, because we don't want to fully alienate the law enforcement agency in the Philippines. We want them on the right side, fighting this war in the right way. That should be the focus here, just beyond punishing the people involved in mass atrocities in the Philippines.
Lian, final word to you. I see you nodding to what Richard had to say. And do you think this is going to offer some sort of accountability or hope for families in the Philippines who've suffered through this?
Well, Filipinos are used to getting nothing out of the justice system. They're used to just seeing their loved ones splattered on the street and get nothing, get no police investigation. So even just a tiny step in the justice system is always a sigh of relief. It's always a good development. And for a platform like the International Criminal Court for the international community to listen to these mothers, to these wives. It's a big step for them. And I do agree with Richard that there should be a reformation of the police force. And I think there is an ongoing program of the academy and the Department of Justice to get the police and the military on the right side of that. But it has to take like a certain political will of the government to really reform the police force and to really reform the military. And
thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Lian, Buan, Richard, Heydarian, and Phil Robertson. Thanks for joining us. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team right here in Doha, thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye for now.